everyone. Thank you for coming to our panel on interdisciplinary research, co-hosted by PISA and the United World Leading Committee. We're so excited for this event to kick off a full day of this graduate student research conference. So I'd love to thank the organizers with CISA for setting this up, coordinating everything, and just preparing a really exciting day for everyone. So in this panel, we're going to talk a little bit with a couple of faculty about their perspectives on interdisciplinary research, how they got into this work, how they use it in their fields. So I'm going to turn it over to Scarlett to go ahead and kick us off with our first question.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily. I'm Scarlett. I'm a PhD candidate in CNI, of course, and it's my honor to have you all here. And actually, we know that interdisciplinary collaboration or research is becoming more and more popular right now. Some topics you cannot do it or solve it with just one discipline knowledge, so you need to collaborate it with other researchers in other fields. So here are some questions for the panelists that we'd like to hear your thoughts about it. The first one is, can you please tell us a little bit about how you define interdisciplinary research as related to your own work? So who wants to get started?
And I will start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Diego Roman. I am an assistant professor in bilingual education here at CNI. I also work in topics related to environmental studies. So in my field, or in my fields, I guess, or the interdisciplinary work that I do is connecting frameworks that address how environmental issues are communicated to or with multilingual communities, especially linguistically minoritized communities in Wisconsin and in Ecuador, where I work. I am originally from Ecuador. And I was just talking with Erica. We're bringing a group of students to the Galapagos Islands this summer. It's our first time they're doing a study abroad. We just started with funding from the School of Education. So we're bringing 22 undergraduate students to majoring in education to the Galapagos Islands, so they can learn about environmental topics, how, for example, a protected area is managed in the context of the people who live there. So we'll expose the students to the social issues impacting the effectiveness of environmental topics, especially with, I work with an indigenous community who migrated from the Andes of Ecuador, and the indigenous Andean community who speak Quechua as their language. And they are seen as the recently arrived immigrants in Galapagos. So I use these kind of frameworks around immigration, around who belongs, how do we define belonging, how do we define environmental issues, whose perspectives we use to define effective environmental policies, whether we acknowledge the knowledges of indigenous communities in enacting environmental initiatives, as well as their languages, how their languages capture or reflect their long history with nature, right? So I bring all of these different lenses into my work. Sometimes I focus on the language component, thinking about the languages spoken and how they are perceived, how they are enacted, how they are sustained, maintained. Sometimes I focus on the environmental topic at hand, and then I bring the language topic as how that topic is discussed using this language. So yeah, so that's how I work in disciplinary in my work.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Erica Bullock. I'm an associate professor in curriculum studies and mathematics education. I always find this question really interesting because I don't describe my work as interdisciplinary, but other people do. And I understand why they do. The reason why I say that is because, well, let me say, first of all, I study what I call the racial politics of mathematics education. So how mathematics and STEM education. So how mathematics and STEM are actually cultural products themselves, products of racialization and then also products and tools of racialization. So the reason why I say I don't call it interdisciplinary is because I was trained that if you have a question or a curiosity, you just go find whatever you need to address it. And I don't consider that interdisciplinary, it's just going and finding what I need. But I do draw from a lot from Black studies, from science and technology studies, from critical geography, human geography, so many places, just straight up philosophy, in order to just think about, and also, you know, different modes of history, to think about, number one, how I do the work that I do, and then also, as I'm trying to locate things that allow me to see what I need to see and whatever it is I'm curious about. So right now I'm working on my first book. And one of the things, the genesis of this book happened a long time ago when I was thinking about this idea of educational equity and like, what is going on with it? Like, why doesn't it work? And I happened across it was an article from some random place that I found that was talking about fiction written for women in the postbellum period, white women in the postbellum period, to teach them how to engage with people who were formerly enslaved in a way that was Christian, but also maintained their power. So Little Women, stuff like that. And it was this article, random article somewhere in literary studies, actually broke open this idea of benevolence for me. And then I was able to say, okay, this is what this is. And then I could follow that string. So for me, it's just a lot of like, it's a lot of fits and starts, but it's also just a lot of kind of pulling at little strings to see what happens. And I guess, I don't know. So for me, it's just natural. It's not like an intentional thing that I do. I just go find what I want. And I also really listen to the world around me to try to come up with those things. And I just also have a really broad area of interest. So I read a lot of just generals.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I'm Chris Kerkessler. I'm assistant professor of curriculum and global studies here. Thank you, Skylar, and to the curriculum committee for inviting us today. I'm really appreciative to be here, and I love this question. Already you can hear like the responses are indicative of the really kind of heterodox scholarship that is happening in the department. So in a likewise but different way, I also think about, well, I don't think about my work as interdisciplinary, but as soon as the question was posed that way, I'm like, yeah, well, sure, like I have something to say about that. So my work is looking at, it examines how in education notions of knowledge and embody notions of power, being, and action that contain hierarchies of values that include and exclude. And so sort of necessarily by that, I have to be sort of sensitive. I describe my work as post-foundational, which means that it's a questioning of categories, classifications, ways that education seems to establishes its own sort of disciplinarity. So to question that, you have to go outside of education to be able to probe what's inside it, what's natural about it. And so, like Erica, I'm working on my first book, and it sort of has turned into this question where I began this study looking at low-fee for-profit schooling in Kenya that is also traveling around the global south. And I was I'd become increasingly annoyed with the way that these reforms are explained. And I realized that part of the problem is that term itself, low-fee for-profit schooling, has in it a sort of economic basis that doesn't really get questioned about what these schools are ultimately about, right? It's an economic solution to the problem of schooling. And you'll see it in these like phrases like, it's cut rate schooling, but it's better than nothing. Or it's the best that these children can receive given the circumstances. And I found that such a troubling logic because of what it assumes, not so much about economics, although that's part of the problem, but what it assumes about these children, right? And so you have to have a way to understand that about what is assumed in education as a developmental logic, as theories of learning, as it relates to broader societal goals, to start to unpack how that becomes naturalized as a good, as something, not even like, I mean, there's contention about whether these schools should expand here or there and what conditions, but the idea that this is a solution of any kind for anywhere, that to me is something that requires this broader lens that gets that, or not even necessarily a broader lens, but different lenses that you can bring to it, different disciplinary approaches that don't necessarily, that you might not be able to find in education, but that speak to the issues in education that education may not necessarily want to address or think to address as part of its knowledge. So for me, that's where interdisciplinary work is sort of necessary to be able to probe those dilemmas. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm Kate Vieira. I'm a professor here in the literacy area, and I just want to, yes, everything. I was like nodding about the curiosity. So I guess I'm going to give a kind of discipline specific answer to your question, Scarlett. Also, thank you for inviting me. So from the perspective of literacy studies, one of the big insights in literacy studies from the 70s and 80s was that literacy is not anything on its own. It's always connected to everything else. That's a true insight, but for a researcher, it poses some problems because then you have to know all of the other stuff as well. So I'm also an ethnographer. And so one of the ways that my research, and I guess maybe I'll start with my first book. Since we are one of the ways that this played out for me during my first book, I was studying my home community and immigrant community, and I was really interested in people's experiences with language. And in the process of doing ethnographic interviews and observations, a few things kept coming up that surprised me. One thing that came up was that people were very, when I asked them about literacy, they kept telling me about immigration papers. So in an interdisciplinary perspective, what did that mean for me when I wanted to go make sense of the issue of papers? It means I was reading about the history of bureaucracy during the French Revolution and the potential for undermining state power. It meant I was reading anthropology of bureaucracy in Pakistan, where paper was kind of stacked on top of each other and people are kind of changing things. It meant that I became very interested in the materiality of literacy and the ways people were talking about it in terms of the new digital age, even though the people I was working with were talking about papers. So you can kind of see how in the field site, like that curiosity, if you want to explain a phenomenon, if you have a question, then it's like you have to go deeper. People also talked about religion. So all of a sudden I was like over here trying to understand like religious practices in relation to literacy, which is long-standing. I was also reading in sociology because I was working with Luso-Americans who didn't quite identify as Latino, but didn't quite identify as white. And so I was looking at theories of assimilation, immigration, and whiteness. So you can kind of see how from a reading perspective, as graduate students, you'll appreciate this. From a reading perspective, you're just like exploring avenues that will help you answer your question. And I think in a field like literacy studies and maybe a lot of other fields, it has to be interdisciplinary. Otherwise, you're not getting at literacy because literacy is like not a thing on its own. It's always tied up in other things. Because I'm a literacy person, I also want to say something briefly about the writing perspective. So I told you about reading, so now I'm going to say about writing and my own writing. I also write and publish in various different disciplines. And so I want to characterize these as social science, humanities, and also literary. So these are three very different kinds of knowledge making, different citation systems, different standards for what counts as knowledge, different expectations from readers, different languages. And I have found that to be a challenging and really fulfilling part of my career to think about how knowledge and stories can be created across different disciplines. And maybe I'll just end by saying that the discipline that you're publishing in shapes the knowledge that you're making. Language is not a transparent thing. So I can't translate, we talk about public facing intellectuals, right? I can't translate something for the public without changing what that thing is. So if I'm publishing in a literary journal about the very same thing that I was publishing about in a social science article, that knowledge is going to be different and maybe not legible to some people and legible to others. So I think one question in terms of interdisciplinary publishing is what kinds of knowledge or what kinds of stories do you want to create and to what effect? Sometimes recently, I just want to make people laugh with my writing. So that's like a whole different thing. Anyway, that's my answer.
Thank you, Professor Vieira. Tom, so how do you define interdisciplinary research as related to your own work?
I thought I would start by saying, I thought I should say my subject is time and scheduling it. But it's not, but I do study time. There's a joy of this department. And the joy of this department, it doesn't know its identity. Therefore, I can study whatever I want and mention the word of education, and it works. And with that is also, I think what everyone else has said. Well, two things. My own biography is in the liberal arts. My major, undergraduate major was history. My dissertation related to the sociology of knowledge. And so when I come into this department, all my reading is from this other ways of seeing, which actually has been very productive because part of what I try to do is unthink what I think. And so that requires that I keep looking for literatures that help me unthink what I think. And the last place I usually find it, except in this department, is in education. Because education tends to be very incestual. It reads itself. And so the problem is, how do you unread that literature to be able to read it? And that's been basically accidentally, I should say, my whole career. I'll give you two different examples. Different sites of my inquiries. One is a library in Helsinki. I went into the sociology library and I was reading the Millennial. Out of accident, I was walking past it back to my apartment. And that's another thing, by the way, I should mention. One of the things that's really been very helpful is getting out of the US. And that's also accidental. But the more I travel in different parts of the world, the more I begin to understand a certain provincialism that I have to continually try to overcome. And that's very important where call it interdisciplinary. I don't think of it that way either, by the way. But one was in this library. I walked in and I was reading the Millennial issue, a very, very well-known sociologist talking about the new cosmopolitanism that's coming in this after 2000. And as I was reading it, I was saying to myself, but that's what education is always talking about, this cosmopolitan kind of mentality, if you want. But it's never mentioned in either the histories of education or in curriculum studies and so on. And so I had to start to read about cosmopolitanism. What does that mean? It means I was in Brisbane. A friend of mine's brother was a historian, a French historian, and I had lunch with him to sort of figure out how he was thinking about it and get literature from him. And then also read other kinds of work, both in sociology and philosophy and so on, to be able to understand the educational phenomena in the US, because I was studying the US. The other is a book we're going to talk about books. And then I'll stop. One of the things that continually concerns me is there's very little historical perspective within a lot of the scholarship in education. What do I mean by that? There is a tremendous belief that people are going to produce practical, useful research. And I started to write a book, which his title was called The Impracticality of Practical Research. And to do that, I had to read across multiple fields to try to, and there's no place to go. You can't go to the library and look up impracticality of practical research. You can't even look up practical research. And the problem becomes how you begin to find that. That's the next question, I think. But to do that project, to understand education, I had to understand all these other things. I'll give you one very concrete example. Yesterday I was teaching, I do teach, a class, and they were reading the Tyler rationale. The Tyler rationale is something that comes up in the 1940s, and it's a very powerful model that actually was exported around the world. And people usually read it internally to education, but to read it, you will have to understand the changing notions of social science, the changing notions of how people began to think of the nature of society through cybernetics and systems theories and so on. And you can't get that from education. You really need to go into other fields to be under how other people have written about it and studied it, because you can't do it. And so I don't think it's adequate. I don't think you can study education without, even people who do learning science. The learning science is not just learning science. It comes out of a whole tradition of psychology, which is interesting because initially psychology was majored in education, and then they moved elsewhere, and educational psychology became a secondary field. So to understand even that field, you have to read outside of it to understand it. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Well, the first question already is very exciting for me. I don't know how you feel it, but I can feel that many of you also feel very resonated. Okay, so the second question is, what are some factors that lead to successful interdisciplinary research? What are some factors that lead to successful interdisciplinary research?
Here.
You know, there's an assumption that it's all we do is successful.
Failed.
For me, like, I love what everyone has said, and thinking about Tom's response. So I see collaborations with people working in disciplines in my work. So I studied linguistics, and I draw from disciplinary linguistic concepts, especially discourse analysis when I conduct my work. But I also try to collaborate with linguists working in theoretical syntax, right? Or theoretical discourse analysis, to understand how the discipline perceives, like what Kate was saying, right? How, when you go to the discipline, right? Like when you go to how the discipline defines this type of approaches, frameworks, types of analysis that are conducted, how are we in education using those, applying those when we conduct our work in classrooms, in analyzing materials like, let's say, textbooks. So I work sometimes with linguists. I also did work in biology and ecology. So I work with a concept called ecosystem services, which is how we humans, draw or derive or give value to nature, right? Value in between quotes. And how do we think about it? How are we thinking about measuring what nature gives us, not only materially, but also emotionally, spiritually, and who is defining that, right? So for example, I am thinking about these different ways of knowing about the natural world through indigenous ways of knowing, and see whether those are captured by the discipline, by ecological system services, and how how education is using that when we think about teaching concepts in, let's say, life science. So in that work, for example, I collaborate with ecologists, the people who are doing that work in their own discipline. And then we discuss our work, and then just now we published a paper in organism biology, in which they were discussing, this is how we do our work. How is that work used in education? How are our disciplinary concepts applied in your field, right? So having the ability or the willingness, the intentionality to connect with people outside, like the School of Education, right? Outside our field, and see how they hear it, right? See how what we are saying in our discipline or in our field, is heard, is perceived, and having also the willingness to listen to different responses, change my perspectives, change my ideas, has been very productive in doing my work, but also being able to talk to people in their own disciplines to see that that work also reflects a disciplinary approach from in that area, right? So it's kind of this dialogic, like exploring from the work that has been conducted in education, the unlearning of things, how they have been applied, many times very superficially, like some frameworks from ecology, some frameworks from linguistics. One of my advisors used to say, many people in education do language, but very few do linguistics work in education. Like many concepts in linguistics are only touched upon, but they're never kind of explored deeply into how do we define discourse analysis? There are so many different ways of doing it, but many papers I read just say this paper applied discourse analysis done. And then I'm thinking, but there are 20 million different ways of doing discourse analysis. What do you mean by it? Like which type of discourse analysis you're applying? So I think this kind of constant back and forth between exploring, digging, and learning, kind of digging deeper into that will produce successful interdisciplinary research.
Okay, thank you.
So I think the key to anything I've done in my life that has been successful is the fact that I'm an extremely principled person, just in everything. So I set rules and I don't violate. So, and if you've taken a class with me, you know that I cut everything down to like a core rule. And then we go from there to think about what happens. So I would say that I have some principles that I kind of govern myself by that are fundamental to me that I'll follow regardless of the work, and they've never failed. So I'll share a couple of them. One of them is related to collaboration. I'm glad you brought it up. I have been labeled, and I proudly carry the label of a bougie collaborator. And the reason why I've been labeled that way is because I actually kind of refuse to do it unless the collaboration will bring about something that could not have happened if these two people did not come together. So I describe it like procreation. You have a sperm and an egg that come together, a mother and a father, a mother and a father that come together, and they create something that could not have existed without those two people, without those two sets of genes, right? And because of that, that thing cannot be pulled apart. So if it's not there, I'm just not going to do it. And what that does is it introduces me to a lot of things. It helps me to learn. And it's so much more fun and so much more interesting rather than just, okay, you write this section, I'll write this section. Let's come together at the end of the day. There's no problem with that. But for me, I want to get something and I want to produce something that I'm like, you know, if I was actually just invited recently to do a podcast on a collaborative piece, and thankfully the person asked all of the authors, because there's no way that I think one of us could have gone and talked about that, because it's something that is of the three of us. So so that's one of my things. Another one for me is always go underneath the foundation of a thing. So sometimes we say we want to understand the foundation, but I argue you have to go under there because the foundation was built for a reason in the way that it was built. So going back to original texts, things like that, making sure that you get an understanding for yourself, never relying on somebody else. We could have all lied to you when you were, you know, we don't know. And we're also telling you our interpretation of whatever it is, you know, the thing is that we're talking about. So go back for yourself, get an understanding for yourself, and then build from there. When it comes to looking across disciplines, really understand what the disciplines kind of concerns are. So I think I scared my class last semester when I said to them, I kept saying to the first class, like, nobody cares. I don't care. I don't care. And what I was saying was, like, in certain disciplines, there are questions they don't care about. Because they, like, philosophy cares about certain types of things. Sociology cares about certain types of things. They're going to ask totally different questions, even if they're looking at the same thing. So one of the things you have to kind of ground yourself in is, okay, how do I understand why Du Bois mentions certain things and doesn't mention other things? Why Mills talks about this in this way and doesn't talk about it in this way? Part of it is because they don't care, not because they literally don't care, but because from a disciplinary perspective, it's not their concern. So those kinds of things of kind of getting underneath the obvious are really important. And I just constantly remind myself and constantly remind my students of that point about history that Tom was raising. Education research is extremely young, like not that much older than me, as a field itself. outside of psychology or something like that. So actually education research is a field, but we treat it like it's the be all to end all. It's actually kind of a pool of stagnant water because it doesn't produce. It draws everything in, but it doesn't necessarily give anything out in terms of originality. It borrows from everybody, and there's nothing wrong with that. But because we are borrowers, we are at all times psychologists and sociologists and anthropologists and all of that. Because we're borrowers, we have to understand all of the places that we borrow from. So I think understanding that as part of kind of, I would say, your job as an education researcher is really important. And once you kind of get that and settle that, then it's like, okay, let me go out and look. Very practically, people always ask me, like, where do you start? Like, how do I start? This just sounds too big. Handbooks, edited volumes about particular topics, review papers about particular topics. The thing about these is the paper may or may not be of value. What's of value is the reference. So that's where you can, so people have already done some of the work of synthesizing some of the literature for you. And that's a place where you can say, okay, I can start to branch here and there. And so that's a really kind of concrete way that you can kind of start in something and then start to move from beyond that. But yeah, I just think the biggest thing for me is always being mindful that I have to have kind of an integrity in my understanding of whatever it is that I'm reading, looking at, in order to, and by integrity, what I mean is I need to like have looked in it, through it, under it, and myself. And then before I can actually kind of mobilize it for something else. Because what happens is education research becomes what I call a bad game of telephone. Does everybody play telephone? You know what I mean? So Diego says something, whispers something to me in my ear. I whisper it to Chris, and by the time, especially to Tom, by the time it gets to Tom, for sure, it is nothing like what Diego said. But that's the thing that happens with citation. Like, this is a responsibility.
Yeah.
We have knowledge production is a responsibility, and it's a grave responsibility. So we have a serious responsibility to make sure that when Diego wrote the original text, whatever Tom says, based on what he read of Diego's, is integral to whatever, is whatever it originally was. So if Diego is borrowing from somebody else, then we got to go look at who Diego borrowed from. And it's not, I think he lied to me. It's not that. It's just, I may not have the full picture. So just committing yourself to that, and then also committing yourself to the fact that it's not fast. I mean, it sounds like it's not fast. So I made a commitment at the beginning of my career that I was going to be a slow burn rather than a quick spark. And I've stayed with that, which means I work slowly, I work deliberately. But what I can tell you is, it's all, I mean, I got books and books of stuff that I need to write about. So it's not without, like, it comes, it goes, it moves. But that slowness and that deliberation, there's a whole slow scholarship movement, which I read a book about, I don't know about it. But anyway, the idea of being slow and deliberate is really, really important, because what comes out of it is heavy. My grandmother would say that you walk heavy when you're slow and you're deliberate, meaning your footprint really matters. So yeah, so I just have all these little internal that I follow. And that's what gets me to, I guess, what has been called success.
So I am gonna just underline a lot of what Erica just said, especially around the notion of how we have to approach not only the foundations of things, but what's underneath and what made them possible. And you were saying integrity, and I also was thinking about intimacy in what you're saying, in the sense that one of the sort of easy things to do in critical scholarship is to drive by and say, bam, 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 you're wrong, you're bad, this is terrible, because I'm a critical theorist and I'm applying my critical theory to this, and now I can see the world in right and wrong terms. And it's been, I mean, this is like an allergy of mine that it's what I think I sort of tend to do, and I've had to sort of unlearn that tendency to make the quick and easy dismissal of something because it for some reason raises my hackles or whatever. And so to get close to something that troubles you, I think has at least for me, it's been very productive. And it's that idea of going slow, staying with it, reading carefully about it. And I really appreciated that Erica actually gave that very specific advice of like, look at the object being how it is written, that the discourses about the object are part of the materiality of what you're looking at, right? And you can, by going to the cited by in Google Scholar and seeing not just the reference list, but also who is drawing on it and to what ends. It's a ton of time, but that's sort of the bottom-up approach, right? Because like we, in the first answer, I think a lot of us were talking about, well, we read in this field, and this field, and this field, and those give you maybe the sensibilities to be troubled by or to recognize the stagnant bog we're in some of the educational research. But at the same time, you also need a sort of practice to start to see where these things go, how they're used, what they mean. And the citation lists are invaluable in that way. And again, but both the references that they're drawing upon, but also who's drawing upon them and to what ends. Those are two ways in and out of those objects. And I think all of this is to like, well, to what end, right? Like, if the point, and as I think about like the work that I'm invested in doing, it's if education is producing and reproducing these hierarchies of domination, of inequalities, then we need other ways to think about them, right? And so that kind of approach can help you see the limits that aren't necessarily self-evident, or they're not part of the reflexivity of the research itself. The research will often describe its own limits, right? And you have to try to find ways to see the limits that aren't explicitly stated as limits. And so that I think those are just some of the ways that you can start to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to kind of underline all of this in terms of the term integrity that you mentioned, but maybe I'll just kind of, so I don't just repeat what people are saying, everything they said, but maybe I want to take like an individual answer to this about how you kind of know yourself. I think one of the most important things for me as a scholar doing interdisciplinary research was two things. One was really trying to understand, and this is a process of what I was committed to and who I was committed to and why, which communities I was committed to and why, and what was I committed to. And this is like a real question that I think evolves and is worthy of revision, because it's not necessarily who you're told you should be committed to or what you're told you should be committed to. Maybe you don't know why you're drawn to like a particular topic or a particular question. But so I guess for interdisciplinary research or any kind of research, I want to encourage new scholars to kind of follow that and see what it takes you. I often recommend to graduate students that they write the dissertation that makes them cry, by which I don't mean like cry because like you hate it and you're suffering so much, but cry because it moves you emotionally. If it's not moving you and you don't feel that kind of, I mean, I feel like I hear what people are talking about in terms of like an integration of like the mind and kind of moral compass and also your emotions, then it's just not worth it, because it's just like the outcome is unclear, the pay is not enough. So just like you just like follow that. And so, and then the second thing I want to follow up on, since I talked about tears, I want to just talk about joy, and I want to talk about this in relation to data analysis, I think, or data collection. I think it's really important to know kind of what you love and what makes you happy. Especially in terms of interdisciplinarity. Education is an interdisciplinary field. When any kind of research that I do with people, when I'm analyzing interviews or listening to people's stories, because I'm trained in literary studies and in writing studies, I have an ear, and I'm just wired this way. I have an ear for like metaphor and narrative tension and contradictions in terms of phrases and linguistic things. I'm not a discourse analyst. I don't know what kind of discourse analyst I would be. I mean, I'm a humanist that does human subjects research. So I know that that's what turns me on. You know, it makes me so happy. Like I could sit there and listen to people and analyze what they say all day long, right? I think kind of that process of finding out who you're committed to and like what it is that you like to do, like what do you like to get your hands dirty in is really important when you're kind of in this path of interdisciplinary research where it's like really easy to like fall down a hole and be like, no, I'm a historian now, or no, I'm a sociologist now. Anyway, good luck on that path.
I agree with all of them. I don't know if I want to start with the collaboration because I fully agree with you. To me, when I write, and I'm talking about, I collaborate with a lot of people around the world. I work with them and many of them have become really good friends, but to write with them is a different problem. Because to write the words themselves, you have to understand that the way you write is an articulation of who you are. And that's not, I'm not talking about psychologically in terms of how my parents raised me. I mean, in terms of how it projects and acts on the world, and it does. I mean, that's when you said when your article comes to me, it's not the same. And so I'm very, very leery about writing with people. I do, but I'm leery about it because they have to maintain the intellectual field I want to work in. And if they don't, it's not their benefit and it's not mine. And can we say it's an intense, was he and I had written something a while ago.
Formative.
And so I think we also have to be very careful historically about this, because now it's many people don't realize this notion of collaboration emerges after World War II with the heavy investment of government in grants where they require large projects of doing research. And so it's just that naturally there that collaborate. It's also part of a particular kind of political theory that permeates the US about collaboration and participation in civil society and a whole bunch of other things. So I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying you need to historically understand it's just not there because it's naturally good in your heart. But that's another thing. Okay. The question is about my success. I don't know about success. Let me say this. Reading and being, we'll call it interdisciplinary, means reading for me at two different layers. One is continually trying to read philosophically, theoretically, and historically about the phenomena, so I have ways of thinking about it. It's just not going in and doing it. And the other is when I'm starting to do something is reading, in, like I said, the cosmopolitanism. I had to read about it to understand it and then fold it into the way I want to think about it, not the way people wrote about it. And so you have to learn a style of reading if you're reading interdisciplinary. It's just not reading and saying, what does philosophers say? What does literary theorists say? Because I also read literary theory too, because those all intervene into kinds of things I want to think about. I'll give you a very sort of simple example. I was reading Bruno Latour, who's I don't know what you would call him. He's a philosophical anthropologist and writes about science. And he uses something called center of calculations and spaces of action. And they were and I was writing about international assessments. And I was trying to understand how, and in back of that, I'm trying to understand how science produces kinds of people. It's just not there to describe things. And so I was trying to understand also in that how there's a comparative logic in science that in the name of trying to produce inclusion and equity produces inequities and exclusions. And so I was trying to understand the way in which those outcomes are produced by the very way we do science. And so in reading Latour's notion, they triggered for me a way of thinking, but not the way Latour wanted. So that's the second point I want to make. One of the things for me, at least, and I know with some of the other people here, because I know what they do, is how you play with things, intellectually play. That is, it's not just to say, what did they say, but how do you begin to use it as a way of thinking about phenomena that you haven't thought about before. And that means, and that's why you can read across different literatures that way if you think like that. You also have to learn how to read the literatures. I cannot read literary theory properly. Why? Because I'm not internal to the field. So with all the citations and the reference and the sort of conversations they're having in the text, I don't always know it. So I have to learn how to read without getting involved in that. Otherwise, I get immersed in detail that isn't very useful. Sometimes I need to know that. And I do want to know that. But I also have to be careful because when I'm reading Deleuze or I'm reading Merton, who's I don't know what you call sociologist of science, they're very different people. I have to read them different. And I also have to read them differently because they're writing to a different audience. I have someone who I work with a lot who is in, his name is Ted Porter. He writes about the history of numbers and statistics. And when I invited him to a couple of meetings, and first thing he has to do is sit around and say, I have to learn how you guys in education talk. And that's the same problem you have if you're reading other literature. And you need to be aware of that. Another thing that's really important for me has been I had really good students. And what do I mean? Not only are they nice, intelligent, and write good dissertations, part of what's lovely for me about this program is that they have to go around the campus and they meet other people, they take other courses, they come back and I get that literature because otherwise it's almost impossible to find all the literatures that I want. And they really have been a really important part of my own intellectual life. I'll give you one quick story. A former student named Inez Duzel, there was a meeting in Mexico City that I went to, and so I stayed with her and her husband. And we were sitting in her study, and all of a sudden I'm picking up these books, and all these books were books I wanted to read, and I wouldn't have found them otherwise, but she had found them. Okay, the two more things. The university. You may not realize it, but this is one of the first public universities that adopted the science model. Why is that important? Hopefully it doesn't get erased what I say, but so far it's been important. The intellectual culture of the university is very supportive of the kind of stuff I think all of us are talking about. Not every university is like that. I'll give you a very simple example. I had a Fulbright. I'm not bragging, I'm really not, but I don't know how to tell it otherwise. I had a Fulbright to the Soviet Union because I wanted to study dialectical logic. Dialectical logic is a way of seeing social arrangements, and it was a way for me to get away from American social theories of change. And when I came back, I had also studied Soviet research. And when I came back, I was invited to Japan, and I said to the dean, and then I said to the chancellor, I'd like to go to China because I want to learn how Maoist Marxism deals with educational research. It was a stupid question, by the way. There's a story of the comparative educator who goes somewhere for one day and he comes back and says, I'll write a book, and another one goes for a week and says, oh, I'll write an article. Another one goes for 2 weeks and says, I don't know anything. I didn't know anything. Okay. I asked the other people who were going to this meeting in Japan if anyone wanted to go with me to China, because this university was one of the first universities to establish relations with China when Nixon went and they had these arrangements, so they could do it. And only one person from the University of Pittsburgh said that she would like to go. Here, they said, that's a good idea. You should go, and they gave me money because they had to pay for me to go from Japan to and so on. The person from Pittsburgh had to write a whole grant with objectives and purposes and so on, a totally different culture. And this is changing a little bit, but still that culture is part of the place, which allows all of us to move on different parts of the campus. When I came here, my advisor said to me, this is one of the few places where the School of Education is well respected. And I think it is relatively. And that you can take courses anywhere and people accept you. That's not true everywhere. But that also means for faculty, and all of us can attest that for me, for example, not only have a member of another department in the humanities, but also you can go to the area studies, which are the sort of studies of other places outside the US, and they welcome you. They don't look at you as sort of a foreign who doesn't belong. Okay. The last point, and then I'll stop. One of the things that become very important is you begin to undo the way you think of empirical studies. The weakest kind of empirical study is sampling study. I mean, you really need to think about it. But there's another notion of empirical, and that's, I think you were saying as well. When you look at a book, or you look at a text, that's an empirical object. There's someone named Whitehead, who's an analytical philosopher from Britain, who writes about this. And you need to think of that as a cultural object. I read handbooks, I read it for the citations, but I also read it to understand the culture that I'm trying to understand, because that's part of the work I do. When I read an article, I can write a book about research articles, because they are not just articles telling you about what you should know and what's going to make the schools better. They also tell you something historically about what's possible to think and not think in those things. And so you need to pay attention to the different notions of what empirical mean as part of the way of dealing with this notion of, if you want to call it, interdisciplinary.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, actually, at first, because doing research as a PhD student, doing research is sometimes very stressful and very cold, and sometimes make me very frustrated. But now, after hearing the professor's comments, I feel that there are many reasons that we need to do research now. Just now, I heard dialogues, principles, intimacies, and reading extensively, or and lots of stuff. So I feel okay. So let's move on to the third question. But we have the third question.
Yeah, I think we'll just skip it and open it up to audience questions because.
Okay. So do you have any questions for the professor?
You did a good job. No question. Thank you.
I can ask a question.
Kind of alluded to this, that there's some challenges, that being here at UW-Madison, there's a certain acceptance or encouragement or support for doing the kind of work that is slow, that crosses boundaries. And I'm curious about what advice you might have for people who may be headed into situations where that they don't have that luxury. Would you just say steer away, or I'm thinking about colleagues at institutions who are told you have to produce this many publications per year, and they need to be this kind of publications, or when they go outside of their boundaries are challenged that this is not who you're supposed to be.
Mhm.
So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that, having yourselves been at multiple institutions, seeing multiple cultures, and how to navigate these different institutional constraints. Because I think it's important that we not take for granted, right, that we get this space that not everyone.
I would say, I think the three of us, Kim, have you been in another institution?
Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't sure. So everybody except Tom has been in another institution. So we all kind of know another culture in some way. The first thing that I just firmly believe, remember principles. First thing I really firmly believe is that good work is good work is good work, and people can't deny it. So if you're doing really solid work and people are recognizing that work, nobody's gonna, it almost becomes embarrassing to the institution to come against you in some way, because people outside are like, what's wrong with you? So I think that's part of what we always have to remember. So, and that is kind of transcendent, and that's what really got me through in my previous institution. In part, I think the other part is this, for me, this is where this idea of going underneath the foundation is really important, because if you really really from the point of like modes of logic, modes of thought, understand what it is that you're doing and what it is that you're working with. For me, it's easier than to think about these demands and figure out how I can flex the boundaries so that I can kind of do what they want me to do, but also do what I'm doing. And, so you gotta be, as Rochelle Gutierrez says, creatively insubordinate.
Mhm.
So you got to figure out, how do I work outside the rules, but within the rules? But you can't do that if you're just like, all you read is general research and math education. You're not gonna be able to do that. So that's why the depth is really important, because then you can start to figure out, okay, how do you can, as Tom was saying, you can make an argument for something being empirical that they may not see as empirical, but you have to have that depth in order to figure out how can I, and I know plenty of people that do it. And it kind of just, sometimes it just flummoxes people and they're just like, okay. And then sometimes it comes to a point where it's untenable. And, at that point, as we have done, you find, a place that does support you. But I think that point about good work is really important, and don't allow those rules to shape you. You flex the rules, don't allow them to shape you, because what happens is people say, okay, I can't do this until I get tenure because they want da 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 da. And what happens is that person never ever does the thing that they want to do.
Mhm.
Because now they've got momentum in this space that they don't like. They probably honestly in a lot of places don't believe in or believe directly opposite. And they're invested at that point and they just got to ride it out. So don't allow that to change you. Figure out how to flex within it. And again, if it's untenable, then you make another decision. But you have to really be creative and really thoughtful about it. That's the way I do.
I'm going to second that. I'll third it too. The most important thing for your studies is you do what you feel you want to do, because you're investing it, and not only you're investing it, it becomes a signature of you, and it becomes part of you in wherever you're going after. And so you really should enjoy it, and you should do the best job you can. And if you do good jobs with it, most likely, and this has to do with this institution, you're going to find a job. And so you should follow your intuition, but then you need to discipline it some way. I also think you need to write what you want to write, not what someone tells you. And I'm a perfect example of that. When I was, none of you have heard this. When I was during my tenure process, the chair of my committee, who is a very famous social studies person, Jeremy, wake up. It wasn't Jeremy. He kept trying to say to me, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know where it's going. And I couldn't respond to him. I just had to do what I wanted to do. And I think my advisor said to me, look, you're going to spend 6 years here. If they don't like it, you'll be able to go wherever you want. But I ended up staying. And in the long run, 20 years later, he apologized to me.
20 years later.
Well,
So that sounds about right.
well, it was also when it came to my tenure vote, he abstained rather than voting no.
Oh.
But I still got through. And you need to do what you want. Otherwise, you're going to be working in a job you're not going to like. And why would you want to do that? I mean, that's the bottom line. You're doing all of this so you can have some sort of life that you think is related to this. And so you want to do what you want to do, and to try to please others isn't always the way to do it.
Maybe we can do one more comment.
No, just to piggyback on what Tom and Erica mentioned, that you need to find a set of supportive colleagues at your institution who will guide you through this process of how to do that in the particular place in which you will be working in.
Mhm.
So I remember when I came to interview here at UW, that one of the best conversations I had was with Erica, who said at UW you will have a committee of 3 tenure members, or tenure committees called here, which they will guide you through the tenure process, and they will challenge you to articulate who you are as a scholar.
Mhm.
And if you do interdisciplinary research, they will ask you to, so how do you define your lines of inquiry?
Mhm.
How do you create this narrative of who you are within the system, and also how you want to be perceived as a scholar within the university, but outside in this intellectual community. And at my previous institution, I never had that. So as I was going through the tenure process, I was like, I do that research, and I was guiding myself without knowing, is that what the institution even wants out of me? Or I was doing my best out of my own thinking, but I wasn't challenged. I wasn't pushed to explore, pushed to kind of narrate who I am as a scholar. So this knowledge of the university, the system, like when I talk to Tom, I always learn more things about UW, and I think, wow, like knowing the history of where we are, how we define the culture of universities is crucial as you accept the job and as you continue your work at a particular institution, because that allows you to push the boundaries without going outside the boundaries and then not succeeding in your tenure process, right? So knowing that and having a system that allows and supports your research is, to me, has been great here.
Thank you all so much for sharing all of your brilliant knowledge with us. It's a really wonderful conversation. But in the interest of time, we have to wrap up. We have sessions happening, I think starting at 10:15 with student presentations. And then lunch will follow that. I think we're here, is that right? No, it's in room 6. Okay, student 2000, perfect. All right, thank you all so much.
Thank you.